T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We go for main engine start. We have main engine start. And the ignition. And liftoff. Liftoff of STS-7 and America's first woman astronaut. And the shuttle has cleared the tower.
Welcome to the Massachusetts School of Law Educational Forum. Thanks for joining us. This program is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law and is shown nationwide. The topic for today's show is Women in Space, as told by Pamela Freni in her latest book, Space for Women, A History of Women with the Right Stuff. This book and our show is about the 13 women who were excluded from space because they were female. Each of these 13 women had a dream to become the first woman in space. They should have been allowed to go up. They tested as well as some of the Mercury 7 male astronauts. However, as Pamela said in her book, quote, they had the social and the bureaucratic deck stacked against them from the beginning, but they pushed back every step of the way, creating the basis for today's unquestionable inclusion of women into the U.S. space program, end quote. It took until June 18, 1983, for the first American woman in space, Dr. Sally Ride, to fulfill the dream on the space shuttle. But it was the original Mercury 13 women who had trained in the 1960s for that mission. So joining me now is Pamela Freni, who has worked in the aerospace industry for over 15 years, working with the Department of Defense and the Federal Aviation Administration. She is the author of Angels on the Bonfire, the story of the Texas A&M tragedy that killed 12 students. Her latest book, Space for Women, provides the basis for this program, and it is a book that I highly recommend reading. Pamela, thank you so much. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Just a terrific book, Pamela. Also, Wally Funk was a nationally ranked skier of Olympic caliber and the first woman flight instructor at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where she taught flying to Army officers. With 3,000 hours of flight time, she worked as a professional pilot. During astronaut testing, she was a fierce competitor, often producing results that exceeded those of the Mercury 7. She has been unrelenting in her pursuit to become a NASA astronaut. Additionally, she was the first female General Aviation's Operation Inspector ever hired by the FAA. Also, she was the first female air safety investigator for the National Transportation Safety Board. Wally, delighted you're with us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here with you.
And congratulations on everything that you've accomplished, and more to come, more to come. Irene Leverton was an executive pilot and holds an airline transport pilot certificate. She says that she was born wanting to fly. She has spent most of her life in the air. She is today a professional aviator with over 25,000 hours of flight time. Wow. She has been a crop duster pilot, a corporate pilot, a check pilot for a Japanese airline school based in the U.S. She has devoted her life to pushing forward the concept of women in the field of aviation. She has been a pilot examiner and is still a member of the Civil Air Patrol with the rank of captain. Delighted, Irene, you could join us. Thank you for flying in.
Thank you.
Glad to have all of you here. Thank you again. And I'm Diane Sullivan, your host for today's show. Pamela, as you point out in your book, the Mercury 7 male astronauts were, in the 1950s and 60s, seen as perhaps the most famous men in all of the world. And that was because of their famous rocket ship ride into the unknown. But there were 13 women, 2 of whom are with us today, who are equally qualified. They were denied access to space because they were female. How could that have been so?
As a product of the era, it was more so in almost every profession, and in a profession is highly specialized and potentially high-level profile in the public relations area. It was something that everyone just expected to have happen. They simply chose not to allow women into the program.
How shameful. Before we talk more with our two women. Let me ask you if you would discuss for the audience the history of women's involvement in the forefront of our nation, from manning the factories to the air bases during the World War II period and thereafter.
Exactly. In World War II, because we were fighting the war on two fronts, most of the men in the United States, the able-bodied men who would normally be running the manufacturing and doing the things that was considered men's work at that time, were actually called to the fronts of the war, and it left an enormous drain of personnel that was needed to keep the economy going in the United States, keep the war supplies headed toward the fronts. And so because of that, it became obvious that someone had to step in, and the women did in enormous numbers, more than we had ever seen in the country before. Stepped up, and they became all sorts of professionals in terms of the manufacturing process. I was speaking to my mother-in-law last night, and she told me that in this area she actually built torpedoes, which was something that was incredibly different than most women had ever done before. And so they flew airplanes, they ferried airplanes from the manufacturing areas. They did a lot of training of the actual troops that were going over. In manufacturing job, truck drivers, it was just an incredible opportunity for women to step up and serve their country, but also it was an opportunity for them to become something different, something they had never done before.
Wally, tell us about Wally. How does a young girl dream to be an astronaut?
Well, first you have to learn how to fly. And then before that, I took my Superman cape that my parents gave me, and I jumped off my daddy's barn in Taos, New Mexico, northern part of New Mexico, where I was born and raised. And with that, I knew exactly where I was going and exactly that I was going to be in the air someday at the age of 5. I built my model airplanes. I hung them on my ceiling proudly. Mother wanted a very cute little girl with ringlets and dresses and so forth, but I turned out to be the tomboy. And the way I stopped all of that when I was in the gun club and skiing and so forth, and still having her take me out to the airport to check out this 195 as a youngster, I was in the Rainbow Girls. That was something that it just didn't quite fit with me. So I wore my Levi's and took my gun to Rainbow Girls, and that ended that.
Yeah, I bet.
Anyway, I went on to Stevens College, and I learned to fly there. I was very lucky to go to college, get my degree, and all my flying credentials at the same time, which is a wonderful way for parents and their children to get onto the airlines or go into the military today. One cute story was when I came back, my first Christmas season from Stevens, Stevens girls were not allowed to smoke, drink, or ride in boys' cars in those days, and we had to wear a hat, heels, hose, and gloves. So getting off the airplane in Albuquerque, I was really scrunching in. I was flying at this time. I was the only girl that could wear trousers to school. I was scrunching into my shoes in the airplane, ready to land, and I couldn't get them to fit. So I threw a fish, just did the best I could. Coming down the stairs, giving my folks the Queen's wave, father said to mother, "We sent our child to the wrong school. She can't get her shoes on the right feet." And so I came down like so. Anyway, long story short, I've gone through a wonderful 44 years of training, of teaching, of air racing, and I've loved every minute of it. I've never gotten burned out, and right now I'm teaching children and teenagers to fly, get their solo, get their license before they go on to college, so they're just a little bit ahead of their peers, and it is so wonderful to have their eyes light up and give them something they've never seen before. And the reason all this has come about is that my mother took her first flight in 1918 in Olney, Illinois, and her father wouldn't let her proceed with flight. So she held that gene and gave it to me when I was born. So I am very, very dedicated to my mother for letting me be where I am today.
Wonderful, wonderful story. Irene, tell us about you.
Well, speaking of moms, none could be better than mine. She was always into technical things, spoke many languages, came over from Germany in 25. She knew that I wasn't interested in dolls. So my dad, who was an engineering type, who didn't have a degree but built anything that could be built, he went and bought a train set. And I went crazy over that, except I kept building little balsam airplanes and putting them on top of the train So they got the idea, maybe I liked flying. So then I'd get a model now and then to build and throw off our 3rd floor porch. And by age 6, I actually built one without anybody's help that flew.
Wow.
And it just went on from there. And I've been flying 56 years and seen quite a few changes. And thank God, some positive things for women
You
in
created
aviation.
some of those changes.
And I knew other women that did. And from the first time I soloed in Chicago in '44, I ran into some people, let's say, that didn't want females in the air, and I was a Civil Air Patrol cadet at the time. So somewhere in the back here, I started thinking, that's one of the major things I'm going to be doing. I'm going to put women before the general public and let them see what all we could do in the air.
Wonderful. Irene, I applaud everything you've done.
Thank you.
Pam, back to you. Tell us about the U.S. space program. As it was being born, tell us about some of the history, President Eisenhower, and whether it included women, and in what capacities.
In subsequent to World War II, of course, the Cold War began, and that engendered the space race because, as you remember, the Cold War was a concept of, it was psychological as much as anything else. And so anytime a superpower could do something better, one to the other, it sort of helped stabilize or made the one-upmanship that was going on at that time work toward that country's advantage. And so there was a lot of need for the space race because everyone on both sides of the Cold War understood that that was the strategic high ground, one of the things that everyone wanted to be at, so that either you got there first or you got there at the same time as, quote, the enemy, because you didn't want someone else to have the technological high ground on you. And so during the time after World War II, in the late 40s, early 50s, the United States was doing an enormous amount of research, as was the Russians. They were matching us almost exactly, research for research, to go into space. President Eisenhower had a very set plan that he wanted to take the United States into space. He didn't want to rush. He felt like that it was an opportunity for us to show off technologically, but he didn't see it as a foot race. He had a different concept about what the Cold War was going to press him into. But in 1957, that all changed because the Russians put the first orbiting satellite into space. It frightened the United States enormously. President Eisenhower himself, of course, was not too concerned about it because he felt like it was a publicity stunt that was only good for one shot. But the American public and a lot of the technological personnel in the space area, because there was no NASA at that time, felt like that it was a larger threat to our technological presence in the world more than anything else. And so they began to pressure more and more the president, go faster, and do more. And so he was finally put into a situation where he did have to go faster and do more. And so he felt like that putting all of our space activities into a single civilian organization was going to actually work best for the country. And so that's when NASA was born, it was in 1958. It was actually created through Congress in 1957, and then on October 1st of 1958, NASA was created. And that was basically the beginning of the civilian space organization in the United States. And of course then they needed someone to fly the spacecraft. And so they began to look about and cast about and see who was going to be best in that particular concept.
Were women involved in the initial stage?
Oh, absolutely not.
No.
There were a few women in the background working on the space area because some of them were so intellectually and technically overwhelmingly good that they had to. Some of them worked as mathematics specialists. They were actually called computers. They computed large files of mathematic information that gave the test flights results and things like that. But mostly, there were no women around, and especially not in the astronaut corps. That was not something that was, as you know, going to happen for many, many years.
Right. Now, you two women hear about potential astronauts, and
Read
you
about.
decide, and you decide you're going to be up there with them.
Absolutely.
Okay, tell me how that came about.
When I first saw Life magazine come out in 1960 on Jerry Cobb, that's what I want to do. I want to go into space. I want to bring back information and make this a better place and educate. My whole life has been education. I wrote to Dr. Shirley, who was in this particular article. He sent me off to Dr. Lovelace. I wrote to Dr. Lovelace. He said, since you're in Taos, New Mexico, want you to come back down February of '61, which I did do. They had to get permission from my parents. I was 21 years old, and my mother drove me down to Lovelace in Albuquerque, and I started my testing.
And what did that include?
Well, gosh, about 87 different tests. Everything from drinking barium to radioactivity liquids to having our ears tested with 10-degree water injected to see how fast our eyes would become moving for a vertigo test, to riding a bicycle to deplete your energy of all strength, which I decided they're not going to do it to me. I'm going to break the record. I saw the clock up there. They said, well, we'd like for you to go to 10 minutes. I said, okay, Wally, I'm going to 11. So you had these electrodes all in your body, and those were the needle type. And you had the doctors with all the gizmos around you. And I went to 9. I saw the clock. I said, okay, they're impending a wheel with larger amounts of like going up to a 45-degree angle. I'm breathing different gases so that my nose is clogged. And I went, closed my eyes, gritted my teeth, and went to 11 minutes. Finally, they said, Wally, it's okay. You can stop now. We're going to take all these things off of you, and we're going to help you down. I said, oh, I don't need help. And the minute I started to swing my leg, I just fell right down on the ground. And they picked me up, put me to bed. And this is how we were rid of all of our strength in 10 minutes. Wow. And we did it. And then there were other tests where they x-rayed everything in our body. They were looking for this perfect specimen. As we know, they took hundreds of men, of which we had 7. They took 25 women, of which we came out Mercury 13. So is there an equation problem here? Yes, I think there is. We did better in so many areas, and I in the pulmonary area, because I was brought up at 7,000 feet, and I could keep, if anybody saw the right stuff, I kept that ball up there for a very, very long time. So I've gone on to other testing, which would be equivalent to what some of the men had taken on my own time and my own financial areas, and have encompassed a lot of testing. And I've gone over to Russia and tested with the cosmonauts, because I am going. I always knew I was going when that telegram came and said that Pensacola was canceled. I am going to get the money with sponsorship somehow, and I will be going up, and I'll talk about that a little bit later.
Okay. Irene, tell us about you, your testing, how you got involved in the Mercury program.
I got a phone call late one night, and this man mentioned tests at Lovelace, and would I be interested? He didn't say anything about Mercury 7 or anything. And I said, sure, because anytime I could prove something, I was into it. I thought, And he said, we'll send you paperwork. They did. I read it, signed it, sent it back, and then they gave me a date to show up at Lovelace. And that was it. She told you about the tests.
What does Dr. Lovelace conclude about the suitability of women for space travel?
He was sort of a quiet man, but when he interviewed me at the end, he seemed very relaxed and not just pleased with me, but everybody that had been through there. And I have never been a tiny person. If I get down to 155, I'm skinnier than a rail. And he said, you'll have to lose about 10 pounds. I thought, I guess I won't eat, for a month or something. But that was the only thing he said. And anyhow, I just remember saying that. I'm going to do this and do the best I can, and that was it.
Did you believe you were going to get to go up into space?
I was never told that. People got different ideas from different things that were said. But I thought, I knew about the Mercury 7 testing and all this, and I thought, And I didn't know who else was there. Turned out there were 5 people that I already knew before that took the test. but I went by myself. The other person didn't show up.
Irene, did you believe if you tested as well as the males that you would be given the opportunity?
I already had a little over 9,000 hours and a lot of sex discrimination. So I went in there with my mother's determination that hope for the best, do your best, but don't be surprised. So when Pensacola was turned down 2 days before we were to leave, remember that? I remember saying, so what else is new? And then someone interviewed me and I said the same thing. And I just determined to go on and do as much in aviation as I could.
And that you have done. And Irene, we need to take a break, so to our viewing audience, please stay tuned and we'll be right back. Thanks for joining us.
Every time an adult gives up on our kids, every time we surrender to the belief that their future is out of our hands, another child is left behind. I'm General Colin Powell, and I don't believe in giving up. That's why I'm asking you to join America's Promise. Log on to americaspromise.org or give us a call. Whoever you are, wherever you are, you can do something important. Pull your weight.
They won't leave you for someone younger. They won't notice you've gained weight. They won't fire you. They won't talk about you behind your back. All they'll ever do is love you. Find the love of your life. Visit Petfinder at aspca.org.
Hey, this phone's taken.
Son, will this help you?
Maybe the last thing you would do for somebody should be the first.
Thanks. Hey, I appreciate it.
A message from the Credit Union Foundation and your hometown credit union.
Welcome back to the Educational Forum, where we're discussing women in space. Pam, tell us about Jerry Cobb. Who was she and what role did she play?
She was actually very important in the whole process that you've heard here this morning, because she was the first person that was ever contacted for the Women in Space program. She was 29 at the time. I had 10,000 hours in the air, which is a huge amount for anyone, but for someone that young, it was an extraordinarily large number. And she also held many records at the time, altitude, speed, several of those. And so she was an extraordinarily accomplished flyer. And so in 1959, subsequent to the Mercury 7 having been announced, but prior to any other woman ever having gone into space, Dr. Randy Lovelace from the Lovelace Clinic in Albuquerque, New Mexico, who had done a lot of the biomedical testing on the Mercury 7, contacted her in Florida one day and told her about the item that they had concepted, the program that they had in mind. And she was very excited because this was her, this fit within her heart very well. And so subsequent to that, she went to Lovelace and tested, just like Wally and Irene have talked about, and she did as well as they did, and Lovelace was very excited about it. And so he asked her if, in fact, she could find other women aviators who might test as well as she did and be as enthusiastic. And so she did, of course, and that's how the 25 personnel were actually asked to come to Lovelace, various means of communicating with them. And so she's the one that sort of was the initial, the one that kicked off the whole thing. It was her results, I think, that actually made them so enthusiastic and actually made them go out and want to find other people who were as good as she.
She is named as a consultant to NASA. What was that all about?
That happened in 1962, and that was one of the things that has still left many of us scratching our heads, because at that point, NASA was not being pressed very hard to bring women on board. They were thinking about it. It was something that the nation was ready for because everyone knew the Russians were about to put someone up. And it was one of the last firsts that the United States had to do in space. Of course, we did not have the first man, we did not have the first animal, we did not have the first orbiting satellite. So there was only actually one first, significant first left, and everyone was concerned that we might miss it. And so they weren't really being pressed to do a lot for women, although the genesis of this program seemed to have been around the fact that the United States was positioning itself for the last first. And so the consultant item was announced in 1962 by NASA Administrator James Webb. And to this day, I'm not sure anyone has really figured all that out, because she actually became a consultant. She was flown to Washington and sworn in. She sat in NASA and did nothing for a year. And so that's the one step that, even as I've done my research, I don't quite understand.
Okay, so the next thing that happens, as I understand it, is we go to congressional hearings on whether women can go into space.
Well, actually what happened was the testing process next. As you know, Jerry was at the beginning, and several other women came behind her, and they went through 3 different areas of the types of testing. And then after the final version of testing, which was supposed to have happened to Pensacola, Florida, was canceled, then the Senate hearings occurred, and it was a special advisory committee on the requirements for astronauts.
Tell us about John Glenn's testimony.
Well, on the second day of the testimony, the first day, a couple of the women had been asked to come in and discuss their testing and talk to the Senate subcommittee about why they were qualified or why they were not qualified. And then on the second day, 2 of the Mercury 7 were asked to come in and discuss why they thought women might or might not be qualified. And quite frankly, the 2 astronauts that were asked to come in, John Glenn was one of them, they didn't think women were qualified at all. And he basically said that there was not any methodology that he could think of that would actually make a woman qualified, because they were not good in emergency situations. And of course, the main criteria that kept most of the women from becoming astronauts was the demand in the job announcement that said they had to be test pilots. The only way you could be a test pilot in the 1960s was to be in the military and have graduated from one of the 2 test pilot schools in the United States.
Which excluded women.
It excluded women, all women.
So it was impossible.
That is correct, it was impossible.
Yet these women have their hearts, their souls, and all their training in the idea they're going to get equal opportunity.
Exactly.
One last thing, Pam. In my research, what I found was part of John Glenn's testimony to Congress. And let me read it to you, and I think you have it restated in your book on page 105. He says, quote, "I think it gets back to the way our social order is organized, really. It's just a fact. The men go off and fight the wars and fly the airplanes, and they come back and they help design, build, and test them. The fact that women are not in this field is a fact of our social order."
That is in fact a direct quote, and quite frankly I didn't believe it, because I wanted to make sure that he had actually said that. And so I went to the Library of Congress and had a copy of the Congressional Record copied for me so I could actually read his words. And according to the Congressional Record, it happened.
Wow. I'm moving ahead a little in time. John Glenn goes up a second time, not too long ago. How did you feel?
Wasn't too really pleased, because I knew that being down in Houston and talking to Eileen and a lot of the women astronauts that I do know, whether they were mission specialists or pilots, that took a slot away from some young person that had trained 3 years for that seat. So he wanted to go up for a biological reason. However, I found out later that through the Senate and through his contacts, that was a done deal. I have yet to see a record that has helped folks that are of age that this would have helped. I know that we look better in space because our wrinkles go away, but biologically, I have never seen a report. So he wanted his glory again, I think that maybe Jerry or one of us could have
Should
gone
have
and done
gone
just
up.
as well. So the slot, it's too bad that it happened.
I bring this up because I agree with you. John Glenn to me had always been the national hero. And then when I read his testimony, and I'm told that set Women in Space back 20 years. Okay, they relied on his testimony that much. It seems to me that he should have stepped aside and one of you two should have went up into space. So I wondered how you felt.
Well, that's how I felt. And the interesting thing about it is he was trained a little bit, but when he said, well, gee, in Mercury, I only had 6 or 9 switches and so many instruments trained for, obviously. But going to Russia, being trained on Mir, I know I could fly Soyuz. I couldn't dock. It takes almost a year to learn how to dock. I could have done it.
I'm sure you could have. Irene, do you still want to go into space?
I would like to see first if I could pass that physical. I keep passing my commercial pilot's physical. I'm not too sure about it. I was really down on NASA in particular. I still don't know who John Glenn is. Who is he? And on and on. I've sort of carried this load with me a long time.
I'm sure you have. I can imagine how you must have felt back then, and I'm curious. You seem to have gone on with your life, made great contribution, and have made peace with what had happened.
Yes, I did, and I've met so many wonderful people in aviation around the world that it's made up for a lot of other things that happened prior to that.
Were the Mercury 7 men supportive of the women?
Not at all. In fact, I think through the hearings and what I have read of late and some of the papers that I have received of late, it was get rid of the girls then. At that time, it was now in the early 60s. So I don't think, and you know, Eisenhower did put in a memo, and that's all we have is a memo, that anybody that travels into space will be from the military. Well, I tried to get into the military, I've tried to get into the airlines, I was always ahead of my time. But I'm going to make it as a first paying tourist, and so they're not going to keep me back this time.
And we're going to talk about that. Tell me, in retrospect, how would women have changed the way that space travel evolved if we had been allowed to go up?
Well, the payload, dollars and cents, would have been a lot less. We weigh less, we consume less. We are, in the testing that we took, which were the basic tests that Eileen and Shannon Lucid tells me, since you all did these tests, we don't have to do them. They don't have to repeat it. So it was a very costly thing, and so we don't have to do these tests anymore. They just take a glorified Air Force test. So we proved and started the testing that doesn't have to occur any longer. The centrifuge test, the high altitude chamber test, there's been a lot of tests that would prove that women were equally, if not better, than what the
Suited
men.
for space travel.
And the girls that have gone up now, Eileen Collins is probably one of the coolest persons to do her job. It takes her 3 years to study for one launch, and she is doing that right now because she'll go up about April of next year.
And
for her
she's
last
the
one.
only female commander.
Yes, first one. It took 30 years, 20 years for Sally to go up after us, and 30 years for Eileen to go up after us.
Eileen acknowledges your efforts.
Absolutely.
Tell me about that.
I met her in 1992 at a convention, Women in Aviation, in Las Vegas. She and I just absolutely locked and became buddies immediately. She had heard about us, and I had heard about her, and we speak a lot on the phone, and I know what she's doing. And when I went to Russia, she says, now be sure that you do this, this, and this, and when you go up into the Aleutian for your high altitude chamber, for your high altitude 0G gravities. He says, be sure only to take a little bit of tea and a half of a bagel, because you need to sop up the juices in your stomach so you don't get sick. I did that. It worked perfectly. I was the only one in the group that did not get sick. The men all got sick first. So I am taking her knowledge with me wherever I go. And when I talked to her the other day about my next endeavor, she said, be careful and don't hurt yourself. It was kind of cute.
Pam, you wrote in your book that NASA did not try to hide its disdain for the prospect of using women as astronauts. In fact, they said they'd rather spend the money to send up monkeys. Is that pretty much
Yes. They had been training monkeys for many years, and they actually had a monkey farm that they trained a lot of them, and they sent 2 up as part of our early space process. And they felt like that, based on the original concept of women aviators, that they were going to be hysterical and not be capable of handling emergencies and things like that, it was going to be easier to deal with animals they could train as opposed to women who might not work out
or
well
too emotional to
too
do
emotional.
anything.
That's correct. That's exactly right.
Tell us about Russia. They send the first woman into space.
Right.
How did women in Russia react? How did America react? How did the press react?
In 1963, Valentina Tereshkova was the first woman to fly in space, and the Russians were delighted. They had beaten the Americans again on the last reasonable first in space. The Russian women danced in the streets. They thought it was fabulous. They really felt like that technologically they were leaving the American in their dust, and of course they were, quite frankly. And so the American press was pretty unhappy about the prospect of the United States having been beaten once again. And of course the press on both sides is where we get most of our concept of how the Cold War was going. And so they were very, very down on the United States, and they said that there had been women standing by, that they could have done this had they chosen to, and the United States just simply didn't want to go against the social mores of the time. And so the public was very disappointed, and I know the women were extraordinarily disappointed, although many of them felt like this was going to kickstart the American space program into doing something for them. And so Jerry Cobb, whom we mentioned earlier, actually said, okay, now maybe we'll get something going, because the Russians have made it real. The Russians have, thrown the gauntlet down. Let's meet them with it. And she thought that this might really do some good.
When was the men-only space barrier broken for the United States?
The first women involved in NASA as astronauts came in as mission specialists in 1978. They were class of 1978. And of course, the first woman from the United States did not fly until 1983.
Now, how were the initial women chosen? I understand that NASA, once they decide that, hey, women are here, they represent a significant voting bloc, they're not going away, we better endorse women. They can't get women to be astronauts.
That's correct. In 1976, they began a canvass of all the campuses in the United States that trained women in technical degrees. They began working with a lot of the technical organizations in the United States. And in 1976, there's all these memos flying around NASA that I've actually seen. And they talked about, we're not having any applicants. We must do more. And they continued beating up each other, saying, it's not working. What's the problem? And a lot of the women actually confessed, of course, we didn't think they were for real. We hadn't, it was not the norm to consider yourself astronaut material as a woman anyway. Even though you might have had 4 technical degrees, it was not something that anyone conceptualized, because they had no role models, because the ladies here had been hidden for so many years. And so many of the women simply did not apply. And NASA kept coming up with an empty bucket every time they went in to scoop up applicants, and they looked for the women's applicants, and there were practically none. They redoubled their efforts and put out an enormous PR campaign on all the campuses, and actually, like I said, started contacting all of the women's technical organizations. And out of the over 8,000 applicants they had in 1978, well over 1,500 of them were women. And this was good, because they finally had gotten the cross-section they needed. From what I've read, Shannon Lucid, which was a member of the class of 78, her application apparently was one of the first, if not the first, in the door.
Oh, wow.
So she was one of the ones that finally decided that they were for real, and she got very enthusiastic.
Well, that's terrific news. Do you believe that little girls today dream of being astronauts?
Oh,
Sure.
absolutely. I do a lot of lecturing with Girl Scouts, with schools and libraries, and boy, you ought to see the hands that go up. How did you get where you are? How can I do it? And so it is starting with elementary, junior high, starting in with the math, the science, the engineering, all these great ideas. You can kick in any door you want to do if you have the drive if you want to do it.
Let me ask you one more question before we take our break. How do you feel as one of the initial women who did all of the training, held all of the hopes, but had to go without the glory?
Well, I was the kid. I was 21. I had a lot of life in front of me, and being trained and being around my Taos Indians, if a door closed, another one is going to open up down the line somewhere, and there's a phrase called throw it a fish. So I threw it a fish. Sure, I was disappointed, but I knew that I was going to go on, and I knew that life would give me that opportunity.
Irene, final comment?
I was just taught to work hard and keep after the thing you want, and came from a very tough neighborhood in Chicago, so I made it.
Yes, you have. We need to take a break, so to our viewing audience, please stay tuned and we'll be right back. Thanks.
They came from every corner of the country, from small towns and big cities. But they all shared one thing in common. They belonged to a family called Marines, a tough and determined few dedicated to protecting everything we hold sacred. And still, they come. Celebrate the 225-year history of those proud few who have earned the title Marine.
This is the story about a group of kids who volunteered.
Doing something nice for someone. We fixed stuff. Did some art projects with the kids. We fixed up his house. We worked in the woods. Cleaned up the park.
Did something for the planet.
We just did it.
No other reason. And you know what? It was great.
At first, they didn't know each other.
Well, that didn't last long.
This guy is really funny.
These are my new friends.
Are you into it?
Call 4-H or check out our website at areyouintoit.com.
Kids aren't afraid of other kids. Or people with different color skin. That's because kids know there are other things. Worse things. Bigger things to be afraid of. Like monsters from outer space! Remember, friends come in all colors.
Before you know it, she talks. Before you know it, she walks. Before you know it, she knows you. Before you know it, she has a heart. Before you know you're pregnant, when your baby's no bigger than a grain of rice. Before she's a twinkle in your eye, that's when you need to take folic acid every day. After that, it's too late to prevent some serious birth defects. Folic acid now, before you know it.
Welcome back to the Educational Forum and our program on Women in Space. Pam, after you finish your book, do you have any opinion on what the real problem was? Was it NASA? Was it public opinion? Was it testing results that were not as good as they had hoped for?
Yes, I do. I think it was a combination of some of the three. NASA obviously did not want this to happen. They managed to curtail it, and it did not happen until 1978, which was almost 20 years after they had begun the testing process with the 13 women. The public was divided. This was one of those watershed moments where we were going through some changes as far as women's rights were concerned, but a lot of it had to do with women themselves. One of the greatest artifacts I found while I was researching this was in the NASA archives, and I ran onto a handwritten letter one day from a public citizen, and she said in no uncertain term, you could see that she was writing with great emotion, and she actually said, "Keep the damn crazy things out. We don't want women in space." But then when Jerry went out on the speaking circuit that she went out on, she got enormous amount of response that said, go for it, we want everybody, and a lot of the young people wanted to be involved in it and things like that. So it was, I think, more than anything else, it was a fear in NASA. They are risk averse for a lot of reasons, and most of it we appreciate it, yes. But some of the things that they were so risk averse on kept the women out of the program in a time which I think that the nation could have been enormously benefited by it.
Wally, I am almost afraid to ask you this question. Are you going to get to go up, and if so, how?
Yes, I am. I'm going up. I'm going up with Interorbital Systems. They have their rockets built. I was just out there for a test fire. And Interorbital Systems is a non-government agency. We are getting sponsorships. I am getting sponsorships. I had a chance to go with Russia, but I couldn't make up $22 million. So I have a couple of $1 million that I have to bring in. So I hope our viewers might be interested in what I am doing here. In 2005, I will be going up on a 7-day orbital mission. But before then, Interorbital, being a non-government funding process, and they are a part of the new commercial space age. This is the first step in building a private sector transportation system between Earth and low Earth orbit. They want me to be a part of this. They want me to be the first girl tourist. So just heard that they're going to be sending a Solaris rocket up for the X Prize. It will be a vertical launch. It will go up 62 miles, and then it will go over to about 300 and some miles, very much like what Carpenter did, for the first testing. And it will be an ocean launch with ballast, and it will probably be out at Tonga, and we will leave and come back with the same equipment. This will lead on to my time going into space for 7 days, and I'm going to be looking out at the world, and I will have my sponsors' pictures, and I want to help educate, because everything will be televised, of course, educate the youngsters, because when I speak today, they don't even know who the Mercurys, the Apollos, and some of the early people were. Mm-hmm. It's not in the history books, or else they took them out, I'm not sure. But they need to know. You don't have to be with Russia, you don't have to be with NASA, and China's right on our doorstep. So God bless Interorbital Systems for starting up having a rocket. I've been with 2 other companies, but since 9/11 they have not been able to produce a rocket. So I am working with the scientists, and I have slept on the floor of the laboratory, and I am seeing the progress that they're making, and my habitable situation is being built as we speak out of carbon and really tough fiberglass, and I can hardly wait to sit on that rocket and be boosted into space.
Well, Irene, I don't know about you. I don't want to go, but we'll be right there cheering you on.
Come on out and see it.
Education, 1986, terrible time. We lost Judith Resnick, we lost Krista McAuliffe. How did that impact women in space travel, if at all?
As far as I can tell, it did not impact women specifically. Of course, there was a hiatus on any sort of launches for the next 18 months while everyone tried to find out what happened, make sure it never happens again. And in fact, I don't think it actually hurt women at all in this particular situation, because in the class of 87, of course, there were women when they chose the next class of astronauts.
And tell us about some of those women.
Well, as I mentioned, in the class of 87, there was 2 women involved in that class, and one of them was Mae Jemison, Dr. Jemison, who was the first African-American woman astronaut for the United States. And she was an extraordinarily talented woman who had been in medical practice in California, and she's also either at that time had an engineering degree or was pursuing an engineering degree, and because that was one of her side interests. And so she was chosen, and of course she has subsequently gone into space. And I believe she's back at her practice now. I don't believe that she's with NASA any longer.
We now have Eileen Collins commanding an American spacecraft. Have we reached equality?
No. We have had approximately 43 women chosen as astronauts for the United States, compared to hundreds of men. Within that 43, there are only 3 women who have been qualified as pilots, and only one of those women, as you mentioned, Eileen, is the mission commander now. And so the pilots sit in the right seat, and the mission commander is the commander of the overall mission itself. And I have always struggled with the fact that NASA believes that they have reached equality when they brought 40 some odd women into the program. But when you get down to it, in the last 40 years since the first United States man was the commander of a mission, they've had hundreds of men doing that. We've only had one woman that was a mission commander. And so I think that maybe the equality is still to be reached.
Irene, what would you tell the young girls in the audience that dream of flying, perhaps becoming astronauts?
I'd say take care of your health, be very athletic, get at least a 4-year degree in some aviation or aerospace technology, and meanwhile start in pilot training as soon as they can, and get into the military, and try and get into jet test pilot school, because that's one of the requirements, and go from there. But the backup, the academics are very important.
What type of academic training do you think is best for one with those types of dreams?
Physics, astronomy, any of the engineering degrees that would apply. Astronomy is very important. I took some of that as a secondary at Napa College, and I don't quite have the brain work for chemistry, but I enjoyed it. And just hang with it. And do not get married.
Or certainly don't learn how to cook anyway, right?
Because then you're stuck in one place. And in aviation, you can't. You got to be able to, tomorrow, pick up the bag and go over here.
And it's been worth it for you, though, hasn't it?
Yes. I have 2 cats.
That don't need a lot of care. No. Wally, how would you add to that?
I think she summed it up very well. I have a couple of my students in the Navy and the Air Force program, and they're doing, in astronautics, they're doing very well, but calculus is one of the very, very highest things that they can get into. And if the kids can test out in high school of quite a few of these scientific courses, if they're offered in the high schools, that will give them a heads up when they get into college. But as I certainly agree with Irene, is military has bundles of things to offer the youngster today.
Yeah.
And the people that want to go to the airlines, there are other schools for that. But if you have your sights set to go, now the one thing that they must know that they've got to kick a lot of doors, and they've got to study very hard from a very early age. And especially the young boys, they should get into the Eagle Scouts or to the Boy Scouts and go right on up to being an Eagle. And they should also be in the Civil Air Patrol and go right on up to the very top level of superiority in that. That gives them an edge. The other thing is doing so well in grades. I cannot say enough about that, because they're going to look at freshman, sophomore, and junior years, all A's, and they would like to have another language. And one of my boys right now, Timmy Brown, has had all A's in the Air Force Academy and is concentrating on Russia, and he goes to Russia this summer. So I'm seeing a young lad that I've had since he was 13 go on that path.
Wonderful. Ladies, tell us about your racing days.
Oh. Well, Irene raced before I did, but I did the Powder Puff Derby in '71, and I've been racing ever since. It is a great adrenaline rush across the United States, and you're going against time. You pick your airplane very carefully because they all have handicaps, so you want to always have so many miles an hour over the handicap so you can beat that if you can while you're going across the United States. And you also have people that will give you good weather reports, so you'll know to fly either low or high. I mean, I've come in on the Powder Puff with kind of twigs in my tail or leaves because I flew so low over Mississippi and Alabama to get where I was going. But I've done lots of great racing, and I've even taken Mother on some races, which was fantastic, and I'm sure that Irene can embellish on some of her racing.
I like pylon racing because you're low and fast, and it's split second. And I created the Women's Pylon Racing Association in '64 at Reno. And it took 4 years for a very wealthy woman pilot to break into with her attorney, to break into the men's racing.
Got to have those attorneys with you.
Yes, but I enjoy that the most. And I've raced against men in cross-country races and somehow ended up first in one of them and about third in another. And
I
I've
don't
been
know
in
about
this.
you, Pam. I'm missing that gene.
I am. That's the genetic makeup I don't have.
Yeah, me either. Tell us, Wally, about some of the recent or the more recent conversations you had with your mother about going into space.
Well, my mother's looking down upon us right now, and she has always been for every cockamamie thing that I've ever done.
And by your photo album, there have been plenty.
Yeah, my greatest rush was bungee jumping in a river, and I think it took 3 seconds to go 700 feet. I'm dying to go try it again. So, and I've done a lot of parachuting and so forth. But when I asked Mother, when I knew that another company besides Interorbital here asked me to be one of their first girl tourists, I said, Mother, will you come to my launch? And she said, honey, I will be upstairs and I will watch your launch. So I know she's up there. I've had signs, and we were so close that I know she's embracing everything.
And I'm sure she is. Irene, final comments for the audience?
Well, all I have to say is I'm glad I did it this way. I don't have much to say for it, money-wise, but met tremendous people, seen views that you can't even talk about, and the northern lights on top and all kinds of things, both oceans, and then finally a nice touchdown somewhere after 14 hours or something, and the airplane lands itself and squeaks on, and you get goosebumps and think, I did it again. Taxi in and park, and you pet the airplane when you leave it. That does it.
And you go to bed happy.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Pam, final comments.
Final comments, these women are absolutely incredible role models. I'm going to be at Wally's launch when she goes into space after 40 some odd years, past the time she should have. And I just want to take an opportunity to urge the women, young women in the United States, to go for their dreams, use the educational system, become whatever you want to become. It's all possible.
Great comments. Thank you all for being with me, and to our
Thank you.
viewing audience, until next time, be well.
Morgan! Phone! Yeah, Morgan here. Oh, hi. Right now? Okay. The eensy-weensy spider climbed up the water spout. Down came the rain and washed the spider out. Out came the sun and dried up all the rain. And the eensy-weensy spider climbed up the spout again.
I love you, Daddy.
I love you, sweetheart.
Family. Isn't it about time?
What can I say? It's
from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
You know how inquisitive kids are. That's why you store sharp objects in a safe place. Keep medicines out of reach. And if you have a gun, you keep it unloaded and locked away. As concerned members of the television community, we urge you to be just as careful with television. Kids don't always know what they're watching. That's why you should.